Good evening. Nice to see everybody. My name is Melissa Karen. I'm the director of the Mudd Center for Ethics here on campus. And it is my complete delight and pleasure to welcome you to the second Leadership Lab. The Leadership Lab is a new initiative undertaken by Mudd. Our first Leadership Lab was in May. This is our second. And the idea of the Leadership Lab was to create opportunities to think about ethical leadership across different sectors and professions. We wanted to bring those conversations to our students, the student body. And the idea of a lab is something that's been a question that I've received recently about why a lab. It is alluringly illustrative and alliterative, that's the word, right? But it's more than alliterative. It's actually the concept or the spirit of a lab and a laboratory is very much what we wanted to evoke here. This idea of experimentation and collective examination. And that is indeed what we're hoping to do in this evening's conversation, which has two layers to it. The first, the questions guiding tonight's discussion were submitted in advance by our students, and for which we're all very grateful. Those thoughtful, insightful questions form the basis. There are only a few of them, actually, and we've distilled them, and I've worked with them in different ways. But those questions there are 4 of them, and you've received them on a sheet of paper there. For those who are live streaming, those questions are on our website, so you just scroll down and you can gain access to those very questions as well. We'll see how many we get through, but those are sort of the backbone guiding today's conversation. The second point that's important to note in terms of the spirit of a laboratory and working communally is the very fact that this is a conversation, and it's a conversation between 2 very good friends, 2 people who are alumni of Washington and Lee University, and 2 people who have had deep, thoughtful, engaged legal professions. And this brings me to our focus for this evening. We turn our attention to ethical leadership in law and governance. Judge Mike Luttig, sitting to my far left, and this is a very abbreviated bio in 2 sentences. His longer bio is also on our website. So Judge Michael Luttig, class of 1976, is well known for his service as a conservative judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 4th Circuit from 1991 to 2006. And more recently, he has become a vital public voice on the Constitution and the rule of law. Lewis Powell, class of 1974, a trial lawyer whose litigation practice has spanned intellectual property, and again, it's a long list, okay? I've just grabbed 3 things. Fraud, intellectual property, and telecommunication. He brings both practical experience and reflective insight to this evening's discussion. We're delighted to have you both here with us on our campus, and I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the help that I received to bring you 2 wonderful individuals and also incredibly busy individuals back home to WNL. And I need to thank Ken Ruscio. Where are you? He's here. There he is, Ken Ruscio. He is, of course, our former Washington and Lee University president. He's also the first Leadership Lab speaker that we had in May, as some of you here, I know, came out to see him. So without Ken's help, I don't think this would have happened. He really was the glue and the connective tissue to allow this kind of conversation and this extension of the Leadership Lab to include these 2 wonderful people. So thank you. Finally, before we begin, I do just want to note and share with you that we're already working on our next leadership lab. I'm working with Eric Deggans, the Knight Professor of Media Ethics on our campus. This event will be March 17th. We are bringing jointly Jeffrey Goldberg, the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, to campus. So please mark your calendars. That's March 17th, Stackhouse 510. Okay, so what you all came for, not all of that, but this right here. This is about to happen. It is my pleasure to hand things off to Louis right now. He will begin our conversation. So I'll let you. Oh, thank you. It is a two-step process. Does it work?
How's that?
Yeah.
We working?
Okay.
Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone for showing up. This, I think, is going to be a very interesting session. We have an hour. 40 minutes of it will be a conversation between the judge and me. The last 20 minutes, however, maybe more importantly, are reserved for questions from you. So please be thinking about what you might want to ask, I hope, of the judge and not me when it's your turn to ask questions, but that's up to you and not to me. So thank you for attending, and to the students who submitted questions, thank you also, because there were a bunch of them, way too many for us to get to. We distilled them down to a short list, and I doubt we're going to get through the list. Judge Luttig, of course, is not only among our school's most distinguished graduates, he's among our nation's most distinguished public servants. And he's now among President Trump's most outspoken critics, as I think most of you probably know. Given that he is a lifelong conservative, going back to when he interned in the Ford White House after he left W&L, it has been surprising to some, I think, that Judge Luttig would be so outspoken in his criticism of a, I'm putting air quotes around the word, Republican president. But it is not remotely surprising to those of us who know him as well as we do. So, Judge, thank you for being here, and thank you for doing all that you're doing nationally to shine a bright light on where we seem to have lost our way. So without further ado, Judge, let's get started. And I'll say to the audience that I gave the judge a chance to look at the questions over lunch, and as best I could tell, he didn't pay any attention to them. So I'm going to, but he's a judge, and even though he's not wearing the robe anymore, he feels free to do whatever he wants. And I'm accustomed to that. So I'm going to read the first question, and I'm going to start to answer it, please, Judge, and then I'm going to let you finish the answer. So I think it's an important one. Are there moments in our history that provide examples of moral and ethical courage in times of grave crisis? In the judges in my lifetime as adults, there have been 3 of those. The first was in October of 1973 when there was a crisis between the White House and the Department of Justice, and President Nixon wanted to fire the special prosecutor Archibald Cox. That was in October of 73. In March of 2004, there was a crisis because there was a disagreement between the senior ranks of the Justice Department and the White House, same players again, over the legality of the domestic surveillance program that we implemented in the wake of 9/11. You can read about both of those. The second and third entries on the recommended reading will tell you a great deal more about those. I don't want to say anything more about those. The third crisis, the one that I want the judge to talk about, was not exactly the riot that happened on January 6th that we're all familiar with when our capital, the citadel of our democracy, was stormed and overrun by, I'm not sure how to end the sentence, just say lawbreakers. But some of you may or may not know about the judge's pivotal role a few days before January the 6th that was stimulated because President Trump directed his vice president not to certify the results of the election and not to receive the results of the election coming out of the Electoral College, as has always been the case in early January after an election. So, Judge, I've said enough. Will you please walk us through your role in what happened in the few days before January the 6th and your interaction with our Vice President.
Well, thank you, Lewis, and thank you, Washington and Lee University, and thank you, the Mudd Center for Ethics, and thank you, Melissa, for arranging for this laboratory between one of my dearest friends in all of life, Lewis F. Powell III, and my other best friend in life, Ken Ruscio. For all of you students out there, there'll come a time eventually when you'll understand what a privilege it is to return to your alma mater, just to visit, but especially to speak to the community again. In my case, and in Lewis's case, I'm going to add, that's been over half a century. For Lewis, it's even more.
Thank you, Judge. I really appreciate you clearing that up.
But no, it's a nostalgic time for me. It's an emotional time for me, and it's an especially emotional time for me tonight because I'm here as I contemplate retirement. Mind you, I contemplated it and actually retired 6 years ago, but that didn't work. But next time, it's going to work. But
According to his wife.
according to my wife, but a special privilege for me to be here tonight. Lewis alluded to the fact that I have life tenure, and so I don't have to answer his questions or anyone else's questions for that matter. And I may or I may not, but I came tonight with at least 45 minutes of prose and text to deliver extemporaneously, and I'm going to do that now.
Clock's ticking.
No, in all seriousness, what I want to say to you tonight before I try to answer your questions is this. For all of you who went to WNL, as for Ken and Lewis and I, we either learned essentially all that we needed to learn to go through this life right here at Washington and Lee University. And if we didn't learn all of that for the first time, and many of us didn't, we had been taught it at home, every single bit of it was reinforced during our 4 years here at Washington and Lee University. This is where we learned about honor, truth, responsibility, obligation, civility, and duty to country and to community and to each other. Suffice it to say, half a century later, every single thing that I just mentioned is under assault. For today, and hopefully only for today, it cannot be said that Americans agree on anything anymore, let alone all of the things, fundamental things, that we have believed in through all of civilization. But I just want to assure you today that no matter what you are being told, there is and there will always be in this world truth. There will always be honor distinguished from dishonor. There will always be truth distinguished from falsity. There will always be facts distinguished from fiction. There will always be courage distinguished from cowardice. And there will always be duty and responsibility as distinguished from abdication of duty and responsibility. No one today can change that basic fact about life and human beings, no matter how hard they try, and they're trying mightily today. But to our discussion tonight, everything we're going to talk about, every single thing we're going to talk about, Lewis and I learned here and was reinforced here. So to your first of 6 embedded questions, Lewis, there will come a moment in your life, as in each and every single life, when you will be called upon to decide what you believe and what you do not believe, what you stand for and what you do not stand for. I wrote an essay around the time of my congressional testimony on heroism, heroes. And I said in that essay that each and every person, whether in public life or private life, is a hero. Because at some point in their lives, in everyone's lives, they have to decide what they believe and what they don't believe in. And I went on to say something that I think is particularly significant and relevant for us tonight. I said, the heroes among us, when their moment comes, there is no decision to be made. They have made that decision in the years preceding. In my case, Lewis's case, Ken Ruscio's case, we made those most fundamental decisions in life prospectively. We made those decisions during our time here at Washington and Lee University. So January 6th, I was in January, it was the holidays. My wife and I were out in Vail, Colorado. January 5th, I got a call from a longtime dear friend, son of Virginia, Richard Cullen, and he said, Judge, what are you doing? I said, just enjoying the holidays. What are you doing? And he said, do you know a person by the name of John Eastman? I said, yeah, I know John. Why do you ask? He said, you have no idea, do you? And I said, no, I don't have any idea. He said, well, John Eastman was in the Oval Office this afternoon telling the president and the vice president that one day thence, the vice president could refuse to certify the election and give the election to Donald Trump. John Eastman was a clerk of mine 20 years prior. And I said, well, Richard, you can tell the vice president that I said that he has no such authority or power under the Constitution and laws of the United States. And Richard said, I told him you said that. And I said, well, then I don't know what I can do. My wife was sitting there and crying. And when I hung up, she said, oh my God, do you understand what would happen day after tomorrow if Mike Pence gave the election to Donald Trump? Do you know what would happen in America? And I said, yeah, I do, hon. And she said, tears streaming down her face, you have to stop it. You have to stop this. I said, I can't stop this. I said, I haven't been in Washington for umpteen years. I haven't held office. I don't have a platform. No one cares what I have to say. She pled with me all night long, and we both went to bed with her pleading with me to do something, and my pleading back to her there was nothing I could do, that this was in the hands of the two most powerful men in the world. And so I get up early, like most of you, around 4 o'clock, and out in Colorado, and I was having my coffee, and Richard Cullen calls me back. He says, Judge, what are you doing? I said, I'm having my coffee. It's 4 o'clock. And he said, we have to do something immediately. I knew what he was talking about. And I said, and I said, what? What do you mean, Richard? And he said, we have to get your voice out across the country immediately. And, I said, well, Richard, I have no earthly idea how to do that. I'm retired. I don't have a platform. I don't have an office. I don't have a position. I don't have a physical office. I don't have a fax machine. I don't even have a box of stationery. And I wouldn't know who to send it to if I could write a letter. He said, we have to do something immediately. Do you understand me? And I said, I do. He said, I'll call you back in 5 minutes. He calls back in 5 minutes. Have you thought of anything? I said, no, I haven't. And he says, I'll call back in 5 minutes more. Calls back in 5 minutes more. No, Richard, I haven't thought of anything. I'm racking my brain. He says, I'll call back in 10 minutes, but you have to think of something now. So he calls back in 10 minutes, and he says, what have you thought of? And I said, well, Richard, I opened a Twitter account a few weeks ago, but I don't know how to tweet. And he said, perfect. Do it now. And I said, well, what did you not understand? I don't know how. And he said, do it now, please. I said, Richard, I will never speak a word that the Vice President of the United States of America doesn't himself approve. He said, I'll call you right back. Calls me right back. The Vice President does not need to see what you're going to say. And I said, I'm not writing it. He said, write it. So I did. I had been writing what came to be the so-called tweet heard around the world during these conversations. So I had it ready. So I went straight downstairs to my computer and did the only thing I knew how to do, which is transpose what I had on my iPhone into a Word document, cut it up into 140 characters or whatever on earth it is, and then call my tech-savvy son and say, how do I do this? My son, of course, said, Dad, I don't have time for this. You and Mom are dinosaurs. You're going to have to learn to do this at some point. Do it yourself. I was compos mentis. I said, son, you either tell me how to do this or I'll cut you out of the will. He groused, of course, and said, do you know how to open your email, Dad? And I said, I do. He said, the instructions for sending a thread are in your email. Open this Google or Twitter instructions, tweeted, push the button. 3, 4, 5 minutes later, Richard Cullen called back and he said, Judge, your tweet is on the front page of the New York Times. And I said, Richard, just leave me alone. And hung up on him. And from that moment until this moment, that's pretty much all I've done for the past 5 years is that and all the follow-on to that one tweet. But the only point of the story for you tonight is this. I had been preparing at that point for 65 years. Preparing for 65 years for that moment, January 6, 2021. Of course, having no earthly idea that anything would ever come along like that, and certainly not that. But I was ready. I had made my decision long ago. I had made my decision in 1976, before I left Lexington, Virginia, as to what I would do on January 6, 2021.
I've heard this story before, as you might imagine, and it gives me chills. Honest to goodness. Right man in the right place at the right time. Judge, you've always had close relationships with your law clerks. You've had how many law clerks? 40-some?
51 or 2.
Yeah, almost all of whom would go on and clerk for the United States Supreme Court. And I know this because I've followed your career, that you've always maintained close personal and professional relationships with your law clerk. John Eastman, one of your law clerks, how hard for you was it to basically communicate to the Vice President of the United States, who had just been in the Oval Office with the President, to say to the Vice President, Eastman is 100% wrong, Mr. Vice President. You do not have the discretion to do what the President has directed you to do. How hard was that?
Well, first off, just try to put yourself in that moment. I mean, it was surreal. You know, I was being called by the Vice President of the United States to tell him that he ought not do what the President of the United States of America was demanding that he do, on the advice of my law clerk. I didn't give my law clerk a single thought, Louis. This was so far beyond him, and I knew that, and I didn't really care. I didn't have time to care. I was in the moment. This was my moment in my life to stand and speak. And, but it was high drama in no small part because it was John Eastman. So I'll lighten it, the law clerk discussion up in this way. Fast forward to my congressional testimony before the January 6th committee, whenever that was, and the committee. Well, first off, you know, hundreds of televisions, cameras in my face. You know, it's the proverbial world is watching, and you know, and I'm terrified. You know, I'm not ashamed to say it. I had been preparing for months in isolation from my family and friends in South Carolina, and I had drafted what was later said to be historic testimony, and I had refused to tell the Congress that I had prepared that testimony. So they had just gotten it from CNN that morning, and they were more than mad. And they told me that, and I told them I frankly didn't care.
Life tenure.
Yeah, I said, you don't trust yourselves, why would I trust you? And but in any event, there I am, and the committee puts up the written legal memorandum that my law clerk, John Eastman, had written outlining the legal and constitutional steps to overturn the 2020 presidential election that Donald Trump had followed. And I'm looking up there, trying to, through the lights, and I'm seeing that. And I hear this booming voice from the dais, and this voice says, Judge Luttig. And I pulled up and said, I have one question to ask you. What did you mean when you said on such and such date that Mr. Eastman was wrong in every single step of his analysis? Well, I pulled up slowly to the microphone, lifted it, slowly pushed the button, and looked up and said to another of my law clerks, Mr. Wood, I meant exactly what I said. To which my law clerk said, thank you, Judge, I don't have any further questions. He called me moments after I finished my testimony, and he said, Judge, and I said, stop, John. I could have killed you. That was the biggest mistake you could have ever made in your life, you idiot. What do you mean asking me that stupid question? Law clerks, you can't live with them, you can't live without them.
It's a great story, Judge, and I remember, as I said a minute ago, first time I heard it from your mouth, I was both surprised but not surprised. I couldn't imagine you doing anything other than what you did, but I'm so glad that our mutual friend Richard Cullen had your phone number and had the good sense to call you not once but multiple times to get you to do what you did. So that's just the first question on the list. I'm gonna toss up a softball, Judge, because lawyers and judges, we sort of have it in our DNA, particularly after law school. We have some understanding of okay, what is meant by the rule of law, and how does our allegiance to the rule of law support and defend our constitutional, the rights we have in the Constitution? That's an open-ended question, Judge, so you can say later that that was a dumb question from me, but it was from one of the students, and I think it's a good. I think it's a good one for you, just to share your thoughts on what the rule of law means for us and how important it is.
In the litany that I gave you earlier, I purposely left out law for this question, but there is law as distinguished from lawlessness in the United States of America, and there always will be. Almost 250 years ago, the American colonists fought the Revolutionary War to gain their independence from King George III and the British Crown in order that they could establish this nation under law, not under men. And for almost 250 years next year actually, America's been the envy of the world for its democracy and its rule of law. It's been the envy of the world for almost 250 years, up until this year or last year, when nothing being sacred in America now, even the Constitution and rule of law, are being undermined by our public officials, our representatives, we the people, our representatives. They have no power at all. Their power is derivative of our power. In the United States of America, under the Constitution, we the people possess all power. We choose our elected representatives to exercise our power in the national interest. Yet they are the ones who today are savaging the Constitution and rule of law. There is no recourse to us. This is our entire federal government, led by the President of the United States of America. The only recourse is to we the people. We are the only ones who can stop this, and stop it we must, or the America that our founding fathers and the framers of our Constitution ordained and established and created 250 years ago will come to its demise in short order. In fact, the founding fathers spoke most often and most passionately about a demagogue who would eventually come to power in the United States of America and then run for re-election and lose and cry foul and refuse to leave the White House. 250 years ago, with magnificent prescience, the men and women who created this nation foresaw this man and these times, and they said it would represent the demise of the nation they had founded. The rule of law it's a known thing, just like truth. And if we had 30 minutes more today, I could give you the definition, universally agreed upon in America for 250 years until today. There is a law and there is a rule of law, and it is the fundamental building block of this country, Lewis. And if Ben Franklin famously said when he walked out of the Independence Hall in Philadelphia, a passerby asked him, "Well, what have you created in there?" And he said, "A republic, ma'am, if you can keep it." We've really never been called upon to keep it until today, but we are being called upon to keep the republic that was founded 250 years ago. And if we fail to keep it now, we will never have another opportunity.
As some of you know, if you argue a case in an appellate court like the court Judge Luttig sat on the lectern, there are three lights. There's a green light, a yellow light, and a red light. And you have a certain amount of time. And when the yellow light comes on, most courts, that says you've got 3 minutes. And sometimes that's extended by the grace of whoever the presiding judge is. But Melissa just flashed the yellow light to me, Judge. So we got 3 minutes until it's open season from the audience. I want to push back gently on something you said a minute ago, that we the people have no recourse to change where we're going. And yet, as we discussed with Ken at lunch, we just had elections in Virginia and New Jersey and issues on the ballot in various states across the country. The first elections, as we all know, not nationally, of course, but generally regarded as barometers of how we're feeling as a country, particularly about how we're feeling about whoever was just put in the White House. And I think it's fair to say that the Democrats had a very good day. And I'm pushing back gently, Judge, because I believe we do have recourse, and the best recourse we have is voting and getting out the vote and getting your friends and your family to vote. We've got midterms coming up in November of 26 that are going to be very important, and I think it's fair to say that based on the results of a few weeks ago, the White House is very concerned about the way the wind is blowing, and it's blowing pretty hard. So do you agree or disagree with what I just said, Judge?
No, I totally agree, Lewis, and I never intended to say that we have no recourse whatsoever. What I intended to say was that for the next 3 years, we have no recourse as to the President of the United States. But of course, we have recourse, and that is the constitutionally provided recourse for changing out our elected representatives. I guess I was in student politics, but that was the last time that I ever had an ounce of respect for politics, and that's only because Lewis and I were involved. But no, in all seriousness, I despise politicians.
All of them?
All of them.
General statement, I just want to probe it a little bit.
Yes, and I've made that quite clear to all of them. And I'm sure they don't think much more of me than I do of them. But no, I have no respect for politics or politicians, and have never spent a day of my life that I knowingly thinking about politicians. But to the extent that they are the representatives of we the people, and they're wielding our power over our lives, then I do care. And you can do whatever you want, but if I could throw out every one of the bums, I would do it. And I mean that. And by the way, some wag out there is saying, you talk big, but you're still a registered Republican. And loyal to the Republican Party. I could care less about the Republican Party. I've never could have cared less about the Republican Party. And the first opportunity I had 6 months ago to unregister myself as such, I did so. So there. And by the way, by the grace of the court, your time has been extended to one more question.
I don't want to impose on the time for student questions. I will say this, Judge. You and I don't always agree on everything, and I agree with you more often than I disagree, but I've been privileged over the years to know some politicians. This is actually a funny family story. When as some of you may know, my father was put on the Supreme Court, was nominated by President Nixon and was confirmed, and he'd always lived in Richmond, and he needed a place to live in Washington. And he had some friends in Washington, and one of his and my mother's best friends said, "We've got just the place for you. It's a small 2-bedroom apartment overlooking the Potomac River, and there's only one other apartment on the floor." And of course, Dad, being a very careful fellow, said, "Well, do you know who's living in the apartment at the other end of the floor?" And he said, "Yeah, it's Senator Hubert Humphrey and his wife of many years, Muriel." And Senator Humphrey, as most of you probably know, was Lyndon Johnson's vice president, ran for president, and was defeated by Richard Nixon in '68. But Hubert Humphrey was a longtime Democratic senator from Minnesota, and he was known as the happy warrior. He was a total extrovert. He was a brilliant politician. And I got to know him because my parents lived down the hall from Senator Humphrey and his wife, and they became fast friends. They dined together. They went out together. They were seen in public together. And back then, this is the early '70s, where the nation was going through the throes of the wake of the Civil Rights Movement and the calamity in Vietnam, and emotions were running pretty hot and heavy, as they are now. But I learned then to see that if, my dad and Hubert Humphrey became close personal friends, much the way Ronald Reagan did with Tip O'Neill, who was the Democratic leader of the House. Reagan and O'Neill, both Irishmen, had stark differences on politics, but they were fast friends. I think I'm correct, Judge, you would know this. Among the first people to show up at the hospital when Reagan had been shot was Tip O'Neill.
That's correct. Well, Louis, the only thing I've ever wanted to be since August of 1972 was Lewis Powell. So I'm going to let lie his evident respect for politicians for another day.
On that note, we'll open it up to questions. If anybody has questions, let me know. Raise your hand. You need to speak your question into the microphone for recording purposes. We'll start with you.
Hi, I want to thank you for speaking with us today. You mentioned 3 instances in history that you believe represent a rule of law crisis. I was wondering, in context, some might throw additional instances of rule of law crises, like the election between Al Gore and Bush, the Citizens United decision, maybe even the invasion of the Middle East. I bring up those examples because they're more recent. And so my question really is whether you think our current rule of law crisis should be considered independent of previous rule of law crises, or whether you think our present position today is birthed from previous instances of either democratic or rule of law crises, and how you think sort of analyses of history can inform our present understanding of our current rule of law crisis.
Yeah, excellent question. So over these past 5 years, I've taken on that question in this way. There are crises in America that are not rule of law crises. There are crises in the law that are arguably case-specific. As you say, Citizens United being one example, others would say Roe and Dobbs, okay? But this is the way I have come to think about this after 50 years of thinking about little else. And I testified this to Congress about this. I said that, historically, constitutional scholars and legal thinkers have always said that there will be a constitutional crisis in America when the president refuses to obey orders of the Supreme Court. Okay. Maybe I believe that at some time, but not long, if ever. And but I testified to Congress that had Mike Pence thrown the election to Donald Trump, that would have been the first constitutional crisis in American history. I relegated the Civil War not even to a constitutional crisis for the simple reason that the Constitution provided for the means of resolution of the Civil War, the cause and the resolution. The Constitution provided. So I don't think there's ever been a constitutional crisis in America yet. Now, everyone else who has believed for 200 years that there would be a constitutional crisis if the president refused to obey an order of the Supreme Court presumably now believes that we're in constitutional crisis. Why? Because Donald Trump has refused to obey at least one decision of the Supreme Court in the Emilio Garcia case. The Supreme Court, crystal clear, almost verbatim, ordered Donald Trump to facilitate the return of Abrigo Garcia to the United States. Well, several days after that court order, Trump brought the Venezuelan dictator into the Oval Office, and he and the dictator told the Supreme Court and the world, quote, Abrigo Garcia is never coming back to the United States. So we crossed that Rubicon, and then there are all kinds of, now, of late, I've said that there's a self-inflicted crisis within the Supreme Court itself, because the Supreme Court, as you may have read, has been deciding all of these cases on an emergency basis without one single word, not one single word of explanation, reasoning, or analysis. That is, the lower court rules against Donald Trump. Trump appeals to the Supreme Court and says, this is an emergency. The lower court ruled against me. The Supreme Court of the United States, when there has never been one single emergency, even arguably, has taken the case, stopped, paused the lower court decision, and let Donald Trump continue. The only power the Supreme Court of the United States has under the Constitution is the power of persuasion. It doesn't have the power of the purse or the sword, like the Congress and the executive. So the only power it has is to persuade the American people through its reasoned opinions that it's interpreting the Constitution correctly. When the Supreme Court is not issuing any opinion at all, but acting, it's acting illegitimately. It is wielding raw power. The Supreme Court of the United States has no raw power. But that's what it's done ever since Donald Trump took office in January.
Thank you both for coming to speak today. My question is for you, Judge Luttig. It feels like every day I see another article about one of Trump's political enemies being prosecuted. And I was wondering if you believe that this sort of trend will continue after Trump, assuming he leaves office, after his time in office, and how this interacts with how you feel about the rule of law and its importance in our society.
Well, first off, this is not my opinion. That is corruption, pure and simple. There is no argument that it's anything but corruption by the highest officer in the land. As was much of his activities and actions during his first few months in office. So I wrote an article for The Atlantic in which I analyzed Trump's first signature, 10 or 12 signature initiatives during his first 100 days in office. And I concluded that every single one of them was either unconstitutional or otherwise in violation of the laws of the United States. And by the way, since then, in the 6 to 7 months since then, every single one of those has been held unconstitutional or violative of the law by the lower federal courts. And as we just established, not one of them is yet to be upheld by the Supreme Court of the United States. The Supreme Court of the United States right now is considering the first, which is the unconstitutional tariffs that Trump has unilaterally imposed on the world. The President of the United States has no authority to impose tariffs at all. That's a power that reserved to the Congress of the United States. The Congress of the United States has delegated its power to impose tariffs in very limited circumstances, in very limited number of countries, and in very limited amounts for very limited duration. There's not an argument in this world that Trump's tariffs are constitutional.
I think we have.
Thank you for spending time with us and sharing your ideas tonight. You had mentioned virtues like truth, honesty, humility earlier, and how no matter what, those will exist. But I'm wondering if everybody on any side, considering the polarization we're experiencing now, if everybody believes that they're fighting for those virtues, how do we begin to come together to find a solution and move forward in spite the fact that there's possibly one that needs to happen in order to continue?
Bless you. I don't know. And I'm as serious as I can be. But until or unless we do come back together with agreement as to the fundamentals of life and of America, America is lost. And it will forever remain lost.
Will you allow me to amend your answer slightly, or just answer? I want to offer you.
No, what do you mean? Amend my answer?
No. I meant to say supplement. Supplement. I picked the wrong verb. So but that's a great question, and one of the judge's best friends is retired Judge Thomas Griffith, who happens to be a colleague of mine at my law firm. He's very much involved in something called Disagree Better. You can Google Disagree Better, and you'll see that there's an increasing amount of work done to, I think, respond to your concern. And if you go on the website of the National Cathedral in Washington, you'll see that there's going to be a program on the evening of December the 9th. You can buy a ticket and go, or I think it's going to be live streamed, and it's going to be a conversation about political violence between Governor Spencer Cox, Republican governor of Utah, and Governor Josh Shapiro. Cox is a Republican. Shapiro is the very able governor of Pennsylvania, a Democrat. So these two men on opposite sides of the political divide have very strong opinions about the risks of political violence. Of course, Charlie Kirk was assassinated in Governor Cox's state. Governor Shapiro's house was firebombed. So they are deeply invested in doing whatever they can as politicians, and these are two politicians that I admire. Judge, I think you do.
I'm sorry.
I think you do, but I think there's reason for hope is what I'm going for. There are conversations among very responsible people on both sides of the aisle that are deeply worried about the polarization and the toxicity that it's causing so much pain.
Let me make this point, though, that no one else likes to make. Until the President of the United States and his MAGA followers come to some agreement with the rest of us, then all efforts are for naught, all of them.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Up here, Melissa, the lady in the front.
Hello, I wanted to thank you both for coming, and I have a question to pose to both of you. What do you make of the influx of sort of radical ideology in American politics on either side? And what do you think of the relationship between that and the sort of disregard or undermining of rule of law? Do you think that that is a consequence of this influx of radical ideology, or maybe a cause of it, or is it interrelated?
Well, like I said before, I never think about politics at all. Nor do I think about political ideology. But the only piece of that I know anything about and have ever known anything about is conservatism, and I guess republicanism. And I guess I'm an authority on that only because I'm 72 years old. Okay. Nothing that is going on today in so-called conservative circles or so-called Republican circles is either conservative or Republican. So I've been asked on many shows and places, well, what is it, Judge? If it's not liberal, if it's not conservative, what is it? I say, it's radical. Simple, radical. That's what it is. So, the reason that I've been able to speak as effectively as I have been able to is because people tell me I'm a very conservative person and have been since the day I was born. So when I tell people what I just told you, they believe me, as they ought. I've never had one thought in 50 years on the vanguard of conservative legal thought like these so-called conservatives are having every day in America right now. Unrecognizable. It's radical. This is not what the founding fathers thought for this country. And it can't be sustained because it's a war on the fundamental principles and values of America. It's that simple.
So thank you both for a very thoughtful, enriching conversation that is going to stick with all of us, I think, for a while as we continue to process. So thank you, and thank all of you.